half a degree above or below our recent averages, so 1960 to 1990 average. That's what we often use as a baseline for future climate change in New South Wales. So it's worth thinking about how much of our current day civilisation relies on knowledge, technology and experience developed in that time. Aboriginal culture, of course, in this part of the world has developed over a much longer period of occupation. And we know that prior to the last 10,000 years, they did experience much colder conditions, up to 4 degrees cooler than the current day, and multiple significant changes in sea level rise and climate change, so along the coastal regions. So how did they adapt to such large changes? And I guess the answer is in a very rich culture that embodied its relationship to land and sea in a way that we that have come here, those of us that have come here from across the seas, may have once had, but have perhaps moved a bit further away from. So our systems of government and management have often come from places overseas and you know, have developed during this most recent climate interlude. So recently those activities have led to a major increase in release of greenhouse gases on a large scale, such a large scale that we're now impacting the climate of the whole planet. So that's by way of setting the wider timeline and context to what we'll be talking about today. But to bring things back to the current day and the topic that we've brought together, fortunately for me, Small Farms Network, and I will tell you about who I am in a minute, so I'll get to that in a second. Small Farms Network did ask you some questions when you registered for this symposium. And here's what you told us you wanted to know. So I've grouped them into questions around the broader climate change overview and also specific adaptation information. So you asked us to tell you about climatic impacts on native vegetation, soils, regional weather. How will farm tourism be impacted? What are threats and options for preparing for climate change? How can we plan for climate change? How can small farms contribute to a whole of landscape response? They're in the broader category, and these are all things that I think I'll be able to touch on this morning in my broader overview. Then you also asked us for some specific information around how to adapt to climate change. I'll be covering less of this, but certainly our two other speakers, Helena and Harry, sorry, mental blank, we'll touch on some of those more specifics in their case studies. And of course, as we go on with this webinar series, we'll be able to explore a lot more of these. So those covered sort of pasture management, carbon farming, resilient native plantings, bushfire preparedness, water conservation, self-sufficient production of fruit and vegetables, and of course, the opportunity to share our experience, and definitely that will be covered today. So to come back to who I am, Mel Hillery, I work for the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. We are the funding body behind these grants, the community grants for increasing resilience to climate change. I am a local person that sits in the Queanbeyan office, not anymore actually. I'm based in Bywong and that's where I never seem to leave anymore. So I'm actually very local and have been in this region for quite a long time now. We do have a regional team across the state, so we're based in various different parts of the state, and we deliver regional programs as well as our centrally based things like those grants programs, and I'll cover a little bit of what we do today. But what I'm going to cover today is, you know, climate change is a big thing. How do we tackle it? How do we break it down into sort of manageable steps in our own personal and community kind of worlds? And the way that we talk about this is we say, okay, there's 3 things you need to kind of cover. You need to know about climate change. You need to be able to assess what climate change means for you and your community. And then you need to figure out how to respond. 3 steps, break it down. It's actually not too hard. So let's start with know. Now there's a website that we put all of our information up on called Adapt New South Wales. If you Google Adapt New South Wales, you'll find us. It's actually about to have a major facelift, so probably in a month or 2 we'll have a very different looking website, but this is what it looks like at the moment. And on that website you can find, as you can see there at the moment, there's big headings around about climate change, tell me all the information, what does it mean. There's also things like projections, which I'll get into in a minute, which are down to quite local scales. Then there's a whole lot of information about what those projections for the future mean. So how does that relate to impacts that we might be going to experience? And then there's a whole lot of information around how we can respond around that adaptation question. Now there's a whole nother half of our branch, which is around net zero emissions, or how do we reduce the emissions that are producing the climate change in the first place. The information for that group isn't so much on this website, but it's certainly something I can put you in touch with if you're interested in that side of things as well. It's sort of distributed over some other parts of our public facing information. So the first thing I really wanted to make you aware of for this region is that we do have specific climate change information for the South East and Tablelands. So if you have a look at this map on the right hand side here, it's this region here that I'm sort of circling, which is, so the ACTs there is a little cutout in the middle, and that whole region there, which includes the local government areas. So I think from when we asked people when they first started what regions they were from, I think I had you all covered in this region, even Wingecarribee. So I think we had a councillor here from Bowral, so yep, you're in this region as well. And down at Cobargo, also you're down here on the coast, so we also got you covered. The climate change information that we have available does go down to a 10 by 10 kilometre kind of granularity. So it is reasonably local, and I'll explain how that works in a minute. But we do like to talk about it more at a regional scale, because if we get too specific, people tend to think that it's very precise, which, because we're talking about the future, we're talking about projections, not predictions. It's not quite as precise as that, although under some circumstances you need fairly specific information, so we do provide it at that level. Explain more about that in a minute. Okay, so what are we seeing at the moment? Now this is a map of the trend in mean temperatures from 1970 to 2019. And what you can see on the scale there, on the red side, it's where parts of Australia are getting warmer. On the blue side, it's where parts of Australia are getting cooler. Under a stable climate, you would expect to see some parts of Australia a little bit warmer than normal, some parts a bit cooler. But as you can see, nearly the entire continent is red in this case. So we've got a very clear trend of increasing climate. And the highest parts, the parts of Australia that are warming the most, are on the eastern side of Australia. This map changes every year, obviously, as we add another year of data, and sometimes that hotspot, which you can currently see over the top of Queensland there, actually last year it was sitting over us in the southeast of New South Wales. So that hotspot is in our area, and so we are warming slightly more than other parts of Australia and the world. At the moment, we're looking at about 0.3 degrees per decade in this part of the world, or up to 0.4. So that's per decade. So given that we're talking 1970, several decades in there, you can see that we're well over 1 degree of warming in this part of the world. As you all, I'm sure, well know, we've also had some periods of recent rainfall deficiencies, quite severe. On the left-hand side there, this was the picture that we had in September 2019, last year, over a number of years. So that's actually from 2018 to 2019. Red, obviously, is some of the lowest, the deep red, some of the lowest records on record. The paler red is severe deficiency. So you can see large parts of Australia recently in very severe deficiencies. Fortunately, we've got July 2020 on the right-hand side there, and things are looking a lot better at the moment. So much of that rainfall deficiency for the eastern half of Australia, at least, has resolved just for now. Okay, so climate change impacts are happening now, and this also gives us a moment of opportunity, because people are really waking up to it. And obviously that first photo there, bushfires in 2020 this year, very severe impacts, things that have really caused people to spring to action. The next slide across there is a picture of the changing snow seasons in the alpine region. So you can see back in the, I think it's about the 1950s there, or 1960s at the back there, long seasons, deep snow cover, and then reduced seasons as you come down to recent times in the 2000s. At the front there, short seasons, not as much snow, and that trend is continuing. And then we've got flowing on impacts. So flood, droughts, we know we get more intense downpours now. That's Goulburn in 2019. The recent drought, which we've just talked about, and then flow on impacts for our agriculture and our native ecosystems as well. So species moving around quite a lot. We've got things like that dugong there that turned up in Marimbula, tropical species really not supposed to be in this part of the world, and then impacts on things like oyster farming and wineries in the region. So just to put this in context, this is a picture of where we might be headed, or where we probably are headed. So the white is those increasing temperature that I was talking about before. They're observed data. Now, temperature anomaly is where we look at the difference from the long-term average, and the long-term average here is approximately 1960 to 1990. So we're looking at the difference from the long-term average. So if you're above that, you're warming. If you're below that, you're cooling. The orange behind it is some modelling. It's not actually our modelling, this is CSIRO modelling of where we think the climate is going. So these are projections. You can see that they're headed up to, in this case, around about 2 degrees, settling out at about 2 degrees around the end of this century. This is for this particular set of models. We are definitely tracking on this course and quite probably above it at this stage. So what I wanted to show you here, it's an old graph. It's showing you 2013, which at the time was the hottest year on record. Actually last year for all of Australia surpassed that. But you can see here in 2013, this is what we were experiencing. I just wanted to point out to you that by 2030, this is average conditions. And by the time we get to 2080, it's really actually quite a cool year. So that's the kind of degree of magnitude of change that we're looking at. So to talk to you about the regional information that we have available, we have things called regional snapshots. They're available on our website, and Alex, I can provide this after the, if you want to send this out as an email after the event. Normally I can hand them out, but can't do that today, obviously. So for the South East and Tablelands, I'm just going to flick through this quite quickly because it's the kind of thing that you probably want to look at in more detail yourself later. But the kind of variables that we have available in here are things like increasing temperature, obviously in the near future. So we have 2 time periods as well as the baseline in the snapshot. So 2030 on the left there, 2070 on the right. So getting warmer for 2030, and we're pretty much in these conditions now. I have to say it's almost become the present condition, and 2070 is what the projections are telling us about looking forwards. I'm going to just talk about 2030 from this point on, but the snapshot includes all the 2070 information as well. We also talk about hot days in that, which gives you sort of a way of thinking about your heat waves. There's lots of different ways of looking at heat waves, but hot days are the number of days a year above 35 degrees. And here you can see, again, we're really talking about, we're in this now already compared to that baseline time period, which is around about 5 to 10 extra hot days a year compared to 1960 to 1990. And of course, that only gets worse when we look further out. Now, rainfall, like it is on your weather forecast, rainfall is always a more complicated picture. And our projections going forward for this region actually include both wetting and drying scenarios. So what I've shown you here is only part of the information we have on rainfall, but it shows you that the picture is a little bit more complex. Basically, more energy in the system means things go to more extremes more often. They're more disrupted. Weather systems aren't as predictable. And so seasonally, we are going to see changes. One of the things that we are most certain about for this region is a drying spring. So you can see down here in September, October, November, things are definitely going into a deficit. Most of the others do have a range of predictions, and my next slide will explain this. So it's worth, in the snapshot, there's maps of the region. Now, what the maps are showing you are the averages of all of our models. Now, we have 12 models in our current set of projections that are available for New South Wales. That means we chose 4 global climate models, which are the best ones for Australia, and particularly for our region of Australia in terms of testing against existing data. And then we have combined those with a number of, so 3 regional models, and then you get a combination of 12 models in total. And then what you really need to do if you're looking at quite specific climate information is have a look at all of them and have a look at the space that carves out. So understanding the variance between models is also quite important in terms of making sure that you're thinking about what are the most hot conditions I might have to deal with, what are the most dry conditions I might have to deal with, if they're the kind of parameters that you're most interested in. But also keeping in mind that you will, at the other end of the scale, possibly have really intense rainfall to deal with as well. So this shows you the variance. It's split into annual, summer, autumn, winter and spring. The yellow bars are for the near future, 2030. The red bars are for the far future, 2070. You can see here the reason why I said before we're pretty confident about spring becoming dry. It's all below the 0 line there, so it's all in that rainfall deficit period. So all the models are agreeing about that. However, if you look at the other seasons of the year, there are wetting and drying models. So, we can't be as confident about exactly what's going to happen across other seasons in the year. So coming back to our website, that regional information is available there if you want to look for it. So just Google Adapt New South Wales, look under climate projections, and then you can come up to your region. And our region is the South East and Tablelands region of New South Wales, and you can download those snapshots from there. We also have specific impact information, so that's for the whole state, but it does still come down to those small granularity if needed. And so there's specific snapshots in there on things like soil erosion, hydrology, which also covers groundwater and runoff. There's actually a number of them. We've got some biodiversity studies, we've got some human health impact work in there as well. So there's quite a number of snapshots that you can download there. Oh, heat waves is another major one. And I also neglected to mention we do have fire information in the regional snapshot as well, although I would say that our fire projections only talks about the weather side of things. So people tend to look at it and go, oh, that doesn't look like it's going to be that much work, that much different. And that's because we're only talking about the weather component of it. It doesn't include fuel and all the other things that actually also get impacted by climate change that produce these massive fire seasons that we get. The last thing I wanted to mention in this part of the talk is that we funded an adaptation research hub, and it has had several arms of research, and so there's actually really in-depth information in here. And I would particularly point you to the biodiversity node at Macquarie University. You can link to all of this from our website. Those of you particularly in Landcare will be interested in some of the work out of there. They've got themes around climate refugia, the niches of plants and how they're going to cope going forward, weeds, and also some specific information on threatened species. There was also a coastal processes node and a community vulnerability sort of node. And we also currently have a health node and a fires node, I think, as well. So those two, I'm not sure that you can publicly access them yet because they're underway at the moment. But if you've got any specific questions around that, I can probably access more information in all of those topic areas as well. Okay, so that's your know. Be informed. Now the next question is, how do you actually assess your risk for yourself and for your community? Now we do use some fairly, well actually I should point out here, climate change is not all about threats. There's actually quite a bit of opportunity in climate change, and I wanted to start with, in this section, with some of the opportunity. My colleagues in the other half of my branch, the net zero emissions part of the branch, which is all about bringing our emissions down so that the emissions we're producing are balanced by the carbon that we're sucking into things. So that's what net zero is about. They've just had a huge year. We've had the announcement of a net zero plan for New South Wales, and we have a firm target of net zero by 2050. And it's a very exciting space at the moment. There's a huge amount going on there, so very, very positive space. I just wanted to show you that this is very rough information on New South Wales agricultural emissions. We're trying to get some rough sort of numbers on everything, so it's a first cut pass on this. But this is just a breakdown of the kind of things that are contributing to New South Wales's agricultural emissions. And I regard this as an opportunity map, because one of the sectors that has the biggest opportunity for reducing carbon and you know, potentially making some money out of it is in agriculture. And so your potential to contribute in this space is huge. So we've got animals, obviously, big chunk of what produces emissions. Soils themselves can also produce emissions. Manure management, liming, rice cultivation, and burning of agricultural residues. Now, I'll have to say this is definitely not my area of expertise. I just grabbed some slides off a colleague of mine. So if you do have more questions in this area, I'd have to take them on notice, but I'm more than happy to find out more information. And indeed, if you're really interested in this, we've got plenty of people who come and speak about it in a future webinar. Couple of opportunities that exist under that new plan is both in the space around renewable energy, of course. So there's a priority there around driving uptake of proven technologies around electricity, energy production, and there is a specific productivity abatement program under that priority, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then there's also investment going on in new technology in that space too, clean technology and hydrogen, which is worth being aware of if you're interested in that kind of space. For primary industries, we have a productivity and abatement program, and their 4 priorities at the moment, and it's very early days for them at the moment, is that they're looking at commercialising low emissions technology in dairy, wool and red meat. They do have a specific focus for small landholders, so it'd be interesting to keep an eye out for this. They're looking at how to bring you guys, including Aboriginal landholders, but all landholders who are on small properties, into carbon markets, because we know there are lots of barriers to that at the moment. So wanting to understand that better and provide incentives and hopefully demolish some of the barriers along the way. Looking at developing premium land-based carbon markets to deliver stronger environmental and social outcomes, so some of those co-benefits as well, and looking at underwriting project risks from trialling new approaches to carbon sequestration. So that's what's going on in that space at a higher level, but potentially some of those things could be of interest and benefit to you guys. Okay, as a farmer or as a property owner, business runner, how do you go about assessing your own risk? We'll see some really great examples of this later today. There are a couple of traditional ways you can do this. I probably wouldn't recommend this one for a small property because it's a bit resource intensive, but you can undertake a climate change risk assessment. It's probably more for a bigger business though to be doing something like this. It's quite time consuming. I would be thinking more as a small farm owner to be thinking something like a vulnerability assessment, which is a simple equation where you think, okay, what are the climate hazards? And we can run through those in a minute that I'm exposed to. And how sensitive am I to those projections, those potential changes that we're seeing, well, those changes we are going to see in the future. And then what is my capability or my capacity to deal with that? Because many of you will have things already in place. Even if you're not calling it a climate change thing, you'll be responding to drought or you'll be responding to heat or so on already. And then it's about putting all those things together and saying, where am I most vulnerable with all of those factors included? And then I need to focus on those things and start putting a bit of an action plan together in terms of planning ahead. I'm not going to talk about that anymore at this farm scale because we've got others who know much better about this than me talking later this morning. But I am going to talk to you a little bit about the community kind of scale and how we fit into our broader kind of people around us in the region and how that might impact on us. So we have done that same process, which is called a vulnerability assessment, for the South East and Tablelands region. This was actually the first region of New South Wales that we did it for. We started in 2010, so it's actually quite a while ago now, and we finished this process in about 2014, 2015. So it's probably due for a revise, quite frankly, but nonetheless, there is a lot of information in here. So if you're interested in just reading about what the likely climate impacts are for your region, this information is also available on our website under the third column, which is about you know, how do I respond, how do I adapt, that sort of stuff. I'm happy to send it to you too if you'd like to, if you can't find it and need some help. So there were two phases of this work. One was looking at our vulnerabilities. It was a vulnerability assessment, and the next stage was going, okay, now we know what our vulnerabilities are, what do we need to do? Let's map out some adaptation pathways to get us to the transformed system where we need to be. We've now done this for all of New South Wales, by the way. We just finished the Hunter region last year, so we now have this for all of New South Wales. This is the top of an infographic that we produced for the South East, just to give you a bit of an idea of a holistic picture of what adaptation might look like for the South East region. We identified through this process 12 priority systems that we believe need to undergo some kind of transformation to deal with climate change. So those include large regional towns. Some of these are a bit similar to each other because we actually did it sub-regionally. So we looked at the coastal regions, we looked at the alpine and high country regions, and we looked at the tablelands, and we looked at those all separately. So different regions sometimes nominated systems that were similar. So I've got large regional towns, agricultural service centres, coastal development, potable water supply, emergency management, alpine tourism, beach tourism, public land management, coastal ecosystem management, off-reserve conservation, extensive grazing, and dairy farming. So we do have information around the kind of transformations that we think we need in all of these. Have I got about 10 minutes left? Is that right, Alex? Sorry, just to check in there. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, you've got about 10 minutes left, Mel.
Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we do develop these models, which are about, in the middle there is the important part, the transition pathways. So if you have a look at the report, you can see those. I'm not actually not going to go into a lot of detail around this. You can ask me more questions about it if you're interested, because I really want to get to the how do we respond part of the talk. So we've got specific information around potable water, public land management and off-reserve conservation, extensive grazing, emergency management, agricultural service centres. And these are just a few I pulled out because I thought they might be more of relevance to this group. But obviously, as you can see, there's a whole 12 systems in there. So how do we respond with all of that? So you've assessed yourself, you've looked at the opportunities, you've looked at your vulnerabilities. Now, how do you plan your adaptation and your transition to lower carbon, bringing your emissions down and so on? I'm not going to talk much about that, bringing emissions down just yet, although I've got a great example for the end. I'll focus on the adaptation part to start with. So I just want to give you a few examples, although again, you'll get more of these later. This is climate ready revegetation work that our department is doing with Yass Area Network, and I note that Kath is with us today, so she may be able to answer more questions about this than I can. But this is working on, you know, when we're doing revegetation work, what are the types of species we should be planting? Where should we be sourcing that seed from to make sure that it's going to be ready for the next 20 to 30 years or longer, depending on the lifespan of the tree, if you're talking about trees. Making sure you're putting in the right seed sourcing, where we're making sure that we're keeping track of it, because we need to learn. A lot of this we don't really know what the right answer is for, and so the most important thing is that we're keeping a record of what we've planted where and where it's come from, so that when things do survive and thrive, we can start doing more of that. This is a case study of action at local government level, so looking at issues of potable water and heat. So they've got a blue-green algae problem here. Winter Carriby Shire's got a quite innovative approach to this. They've been looking at kind of emergency water supplies. If they end up with too many of their main key water supplies being affected by issues like this, what are they going to do in the meantime? And they're looking at some portable water treatment plants that might be able to bring emergency water supplies online. In the emergency management space, Bega Valley Council, and these are things we've all funded through council grants, by the way, they're looking at bringing some of their community halls up to be cooler places on hot days in particular, but potentially also now it's turning out possibly refuges from bushfires as well. So they're looking at putting in emergency energy supplies that can remain resilient, you know, no matter what the conditions are, but also making sure that they're usable in hot weather by their community, so keeping the community strong as well. And finally, just wanted to mention planning. So local government planning space is really, really important for climate change, and we're really starting to kick some goals in this space. So I'd say there's a number of councils in this region that are really making progress. We recently had local strategic planning statements, which are a new level in the planning system, which kind of provide a vision for where councils believe their development is going to be going over the next 10 to 20 years. If it's a good idea actually to check yours out and just see what did your council say about climate change. And this is a space where we'd really like people to be keeping on top of what their council's up to and being part of that dialogue to help really keep this a key conversation in our communities. So in closing, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about a community that really inspires me, and I'm actually really pleased to say we've got someone from Cobargo here today. I have recently, in the last couple of months, had a little bit to do with some of the Cobargo community, and I just wanted to comment on how they have just really turned what was a terrible experience for them back in January around into an amazing example of community resilience. So they have a number of projects that they're pulling together, and I hope I'm going to do it justice today. But the one that I've had most to do with is called the Cobargo and Region Energy Transition Project, which is looking at how to make their energy system more resilient to some of the major impacts of climate change and at the same time bring their emissions down. So it's a big open question as to how they're going to do that at the moment, and they're basically doing a big feasibility scoping study to try and figure out what is the best way to do that. Is it as strong as actually having a system that can operate off grid and operate by itself totally on renewables, or is it somewhere in between where they stay connected to the grid but can potentially operate without it if necessary under an emergency, as well as building a whole heap of other resilience into the grid, getting their energy needs down with better building back in all of the house rebuild that's happening, better energy efficiency, more renewables at individual and household scales, as well as for community buildings, and sort of taking a really holistic approach to that. They've got a whole heap of re-vegetation projects which they're in the process of getting funded and underway, both to rejuvenate the creek, which is in the middle of their town, and they're also looking at facilities for the community that might be able to help them get better through an event like that again in future, whether it's a full refuge somewhere where they can actually go and be safe, but also something that can provide ongoing facilities for the community. And again, looking at standalone power and so on for that, as well as the rejuvenation of the main street. I guess I wanted to finish on a note of hope and say, out of some of these terrible impacts, we can see real action and real creativity and innovation, and we might just end up with a better world out of this. And that is my hope and what drives me and my passion and so on to work in this space. So thanks, everybody. I'm happy to take some questions. Stop sharing.
Thanks, Mel. That was a great presentation, and it was good to end on a high note there. Does anyone have any questions from Mel that you'd like to pop into the chat box so that I can ask a question?
So I do have a question here. Someone sent me a question directly, and sorry, I couldn't see these during the talk. It was one of the vagaries of Zoom. So I've been asked if I can explain how carbon farming works. My quick answer to that is no, I can't. I'm sorry, it's not as I said, it's not my area. But I would strongly recommend you put it up as a topic for a future webinar, and I do have colleagues who know it inside out. So yeah, broadly, it's it has to be accredited, so you have to be able to show that you've got a carbon reduction coming from what you're doing in terms of planting or increasing the quality of your biodiversity if you're looking into biodiversity planning, but there's also potential to align it with crop production as well, and particularly soil management. And that's about as much as I know about it. So yeah, hopefully we can get someone who does know better than me. And our two other speakers might know. Do either of them want to answer that question?
I could jump in.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Alice. I was just sending you a message asking if you could. Thank you
Cool.
very much.
Thanks, Alice. Saved my neck as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a range of different, if it's under the federal government schemes, there are different types of methods where you plant trees, or you let trees naturally regenerate, and there's a number of agricultural methods where soil carbon is kind of relevant for our group of people. So I guess it's planting trees, letting trees regenerate naturally, improving the soil carbon, and then it all has to be kind of, you've got to, if you're thinking about doing something like that, don't start it if you want to get carbon credits. Don't start it in any way until you've got the approvals underway, because there's a thing called additionality, where if you've already started, then you can't sign up. So it's, yeah, I guess maybe send questions later if you'd like, or I think New South Wales government also has some of their own potentially carbon kind of credit schemes as well. But yeah, that's a quick summary of what the options are.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Okay.
Anyway, can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can all hear you really well. Thank you.
All right, I'll set up my my slideshow. And am I right to share my screen now?
Sorry, I was on mute. You're right to share your screen, Harry.
Okay. All right. So I hope you'll forgive me, but I thought this presentation was next weekend, so my slideshow is a bit no frills. It's mostly photos. Yeah, if I'd been a bit more organised, I might have had few more whiz bang features in my slideshow, but it might be for the best. Anyway, I find that when I'm looking at a presentation, if there's too many words on the screen, I read what's on the screen rather than listen to the speaker. I've only got 20 minutes or so, so I hope you'll forgive me as well if I speak quickly. I'm going to talk about what things we're doing at Millpost that are relevant to climate change, both in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And if at times it's not, I haven't made obvious the link to climate change, please rest assured that everything I'm talking about is in the context, I've selected to talk about in the context of climate change. I just haven't necessarily made that explicit the entire time. And I would like to also say that climate change is one of many factors that we have to take into account when we're making decisions about our enterprises and how we might change those enterprises. It's always there in the background, and in some circumstances it's more front and centre than others. But we're already in a fairly difficult climate anyway, and so most of the things that we've done have been in the context of having those climatic extremes, even without the sort of climate crisis that we're currently feeling the effects of. So I think it's all pretty relevant anyway. There we go. There's a little drone shot from a few years ago of the sort of homestead with some nice pictures of windbreaks and wildlife corridors linking remnant bushland in the background, and some climate change adaptation infrastructure in the foreground. There's a 10 kilowatt solar array there, and you can see the trench going to our windmill to allow us to use an electric booster pump that we run when the sun's shining. Anyway, Millpost is a commercial wool growing farm where near Bungendore, up on the escarpment between Bungendore and Womboyne and Cowan Forest, for those of you who know the sort of district. It's a family farm. There's 3 generations of us living here at the moment. Myself, I've got 2 brothers who are also living on the farm. My parents, I work for my parents, and the farm's been in the family for about 100 years. My great-grandfather bought it in 1922 or 23, I can't remember which. And his grandfather or great-grandfather came to the Bungendore district in the 1850s. So we've been here a while, but it's not very long when you, as Mel wonderfully spoke about earlier, when you consider the amount of time and experience that the Indigenous Australians were here for. And I also acknowledge that Millpost is, I'm speaking to you today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and Millpost, we're only allowed to be here because of their dispossession. We're only able to be here because they were dispossessed of this country. So as I said, it's a wool growing enterprise. We have superfine merinos. Most of our income comes from the sheep. So either wool sales, surplus sheep sales, or we also do some direct marketing now of our wool as knitting yarn, and get that spun and dyed, and we can sell that direct, and also to wool shops. But we also, other enterprises, we grow a lot of our own food. We have chooks and ducks and milking, a small milking cow herd. And as I'll talk about shortly, we've done a lot of tree planting. We have both for conservation and re-vegetation and agroforestry as well. So we have radiata pine plantations, which are almost, a lot of them are need harvesting now, and we have a small firewood mill, which is a recent addition to the enterprise suite. We have a whole farm plan. Millpost is a permaculture farm. This farm plan's from 1994. Mum and Dad actually met on the inaugural permaculture design course in 1980. And this has been invaluable to us as a communication tool, this is just a snapshot of one of the many maps that are part of the bigger document. But I just want to emphasize the importance of planning for general farm management, but also how useful it is in terms of climate change, because this farm plan had a whole lot of stages of implementation, and 25 years later we're still implementing parts of it. And when we have a problem, often we can just return to our farm plan and think about and look at whether there's a solution in there. So it's a really strong, robust plan, and I really want to emphasize, if you're just starting out on the land, doing some farm planning that incorporates climate change into it, but just having a strong farm plan anyway is really important. So we use permaculture as form part of our planning, also holistic management, especially in terms of our grazing planning, but more generally, farm planning as well, holistic management is really good. And I also point you in the direction of, if you're not familiar with P.A. Yeoman's Water for Every Farm and his other books, depending on the type of enterprise you have and your type of personality, hopefully you could find some use for either one or two or three of these excellent planning structures. Now, sorry, just turn to my next back of the envelope notes. So returning to this farm plan, directly how it helps us cope with climate change and our climate extremes. It's got an excellent water infrastructure layout. So we've got a series, I'll talk about this a bit later, but we've got, if you can see my cursor, there's a series of water supply dams that are high up in the landscape, and we reticulate from those to our more intensively grazed areas where we have a whole lot of paddock subdivisions. And this plan helped Mum and Dad to get funding for wire and water, and if paddock subdivisions in the 1990s paid for basically that part of the development, which paid for part of the development of this farm plan. And that's still ongoing. We just put this dam in a couple of years ago to allow this paddock here to be subdivided. It's also in terms of climate amelioration or climate impact mitigation. There's an extensive network of windbreaks, which provide not only biodiversity benefits, wildlife corridors, but shade and shelter for our livestock and for our pastures. So that you can see my cursor. These are big native windbreaks running north-south, providing shelter from the westerly prevailing winds that we have here. And there's more over here. This is just a sort of I don't know, 30% of the farm or something, but you can see all these windbreaks that were put in running north-south mostly, or southwest to northeast. And they provide multiple benefits, as I said. They're linking remnant vegetation, remnant forest and woodland, which shows up nicely in this aerial photo. Back to the plan. If you see my cursor, again, this is sort of the homestead area, and these orangey and yellow areas are planned fodder lots, poplar and willow lots, which sort of, you can see there's kind of a belt here to the west and the north surrounding the homestead area with fire retardant trees, poplars, willows, oaks, that kind of thing. And hopefully I've got a photo. This is what the farm homestead looked like when my parents moved here. This is what it looks like today from a slightly different angle, but you can see that we've got really good protection from the elements around the homestead, and great protection from bushfire. If embers are to hit these big green canopies, they're likely to fizzle out pretty quickly. But it has had the intensive homestead plantings have had some negative impacts too. We've had to move the vegetable gardens outside of the treed areas. So I'll double down on the tree planting stuff. Keep talking about that for a while because the photos are really good. This is a photo on the right. Is a photo of our little smokehouse taken inside. This is inside the garden. You can really see how having a dense canopy of deciduous trees can help create a nice cool environment in summer. So it's often 5 or 10 degrees cooler in the garden than out in the paddock because of that shade those trees provide. But we've also got, this is the fire sector on the left, northwest of the house, and you can see we've got all these deciduous trees and then a nice fire break around the solar panels before we hit more deciduous trees. And we've implemented a lot of deciduous tree planting around our sheep yards. These are some green ash above the sheep race, and you can work in there even when it's 30, 35 degrees and it's quite tolerable. 40 degrees maybe, might be pushing it. But even if that was out in the full sun, even at 25 degrees, you would get uncomfortable very quickly. If you've got questions about tree species and that kind of thing, maybe save them for the questions at the end, because I've written them all down, but I don't have enough time to go full into all of that. This is in the sort of zone 2. So zone 1 is I've considered a homestead and the sheds and that kind of thing. Zone 2 is used to be our house paddock, and now it's subdivided into 3 or 4 paddocks. But this is a poplar planting from the 90s, providing great shade for the chook caravan that we have. But also when those trees were young, we were lopping from them, providing fodder for our sheep. We still can do that with younger trees, or if we want to thin the poplars, we bring the trees in when we do the thinning, and they can eat the fodder from the poplars. Same with the willows. And once again, you can see imagine the benefits they provide on a hot summer's day or a windy day. And this is kind of in the transitional zone between the really intensively managed introduced pastures and our more remnant. We have probably 40% of the farm is introduced pastures, and then the rest is either native pasture, woodland, or native forest. So in the far distant background there, you can see a sort of box gum grassy woodland. In the foreground, we've got a swale capturing runoff, and it's being planted out with oaks. I took this photo just the other day. Amazing. It's amazing to see grass like this in August, September now for us, but normally I'll show you a photo from a normal winter a bit later on. But you can see we've got, this is one of the native windbreaks, eucalypts, and mostly eucalypts and acacias that was put in with funding we were able to access in the 1990s, providing shelter for the sheep from the northwest. Old CSIRO trial plots here in the midground and in the background. These trees here, when I flick over, this is that same area just over the hill a little bit. This during the drought, so last December or January, I'd say that is. You can see that despite the tough conditions, these oaks are still really green and thriving and providing excellent shade. This is about the time we've moved everything into the drought lot. You can see there wasn't much left for them in the paddock. And here's another photo of one of those windbreaks. This one was established with direct seeding in the 90s as well, with the sort of this is what a lot of our native pasture looks like, really low productivity, but generally good ground cover because things don't like to eat a lot of the species in there. And you can see the smoke from the Talaganda bushfire there in the background. So this is probably early December, I'd say. So moving on from the tree plantings to water security, part of that David Holmgren permaculture plan was to put in a few of these water supply dams. I took this photo just after I found a broken hydrant had dropped at a metre right before start of last spring. So I was quite gutted about that. But that even though we lost sort of 40% of that dam's capacity, we still had good water coming from it at the end of the drought. So that's high up in the landscape. It's at the bottom of a pine plantation, so the catchment is always the water that runs in there is always pretty good quality. And we reticulate to a whole lot of permanent concrete troughs and also portable plastic troughs from there. Here's another water supply dam high up in the landscape. We also use this dam to supply water not only for livestock, but to the homestead and the gardens, and it's linked to our bore water supply. So it flows to concrete tanks which are boosted by the bore. And here's just a photo of our big dam just after it filled up a few weeks ago. And I don't know, it's hard to get the sense of scale there, but that's about 5 hectares when it's full, that dam. And it's mostly a sort of a recreational asset and a wildlife habitat asset, but we do draw a little bit of water from it for troughs. It's not, it's fairly low in the landscape, so it's not great for gravity feeding from, but we could put a solar pump on there and have good water as well if we needed to. And this is one of the plastic troughs that we use at water hydrants. So I'm moving these all the time as I'm moving the sheep around the farm, and they're really good because you don't have to clean them out all the time like concrete troughs. The water is always fresh because you're always changing them. I can actually just move that on the back of the 2-wheel motorbike.
Can I jump in there, Harry?
Yep.
Just giving you a time check. You've got about another 5 minutes. So with those troughs, do you move them around on the ute to different paddocks, and how do you fill them? Is that what they're used for?
Yeah. So I move them either with the ute or on the back of the motorbike. You can just tow them around. Yeah.
And how do you fill them?
So we've got these. We've got underground 1.25 inch pipes going all over the place.
Right.
And then we tap into those with just a hydrant that comes off those pipes, just a little upright with the cap that you unplug, and then you plug the trough straight into that.
Okay.
Yep.
And how many of them would you put up in a paddock? Like, what do you dividing your sheep up into certain, numbers per paddock, or?
I'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of our grazing management, we've got about 50 permanent paddocks, and then I subdivide many of those again with temporary fencing, and we're able to do that because we have that underground pipe network. Our main management concern, aside from climate change, I suppose, is kangaroos, and that's why we have these maremmas. Their role is not really to protect the sheep, but more to protect the pasture from kangaroos. So we have them bonded to the sheep, and acting as a deterrent to kangaroos, and we're running a trial on that at the moment with scientists from University of Tasmania, basically using the Maremas as surrogate apex predators, since we've gotten rid of all the predation pressures. So in terms of responding to increasingly difficult conditions for our pastures from climate change, Helena's going to talk about this a bit more, I think, but we're really concerned about our ground cover and having productive perennial pastures, and because we have so much trouble managing the roo impacts, we're still despite our best efforts with the sheep, we still got too much bare ground and too much encroachment from perennial grasses that are unpalatable, things like wiregrass and speargrass and Chilean needlegrass. And also in our back paddocks where we used to run wethers, now we're finding a lot of tea tree and kunzea taking over kangaroo grass, areas that were kangaroo grass and wallaby grass. So as I said, we're trialling the Maremas before we go out and spend $200,000 or $300,000 on a kangaroo-proof fence. We're hopeful that the Maremas might take some of that pressure away. But our pastures, this is what a normal winter would look like before the weather warms up. We try and manage the sheep in one mob as long as possible, but at the moment we've got them split up into 5 or 6 mobs because they're lambing. But we try and manage for long recovery periods that allow both our C3s and our C4 grasses to have recovered before the sheep come back. So we like I said, we've got 50 plus paddocks. If we have the sheep in one mob most of the time, then you can understand that most of the most of the paddocks are free to grow without being grazed. But overgrazing is a big problem for us because of the roo issue. So this is what the farm looked like when we were in the summer, when we were suffering from the drought. You can see the bare ground there, and we put the sheep into a feedlot around this time. We probably should have done it a bit earlier, but we sold a lot of sheep and then put the rest into a feedlot. That's the photo I was trying to introduce earlier, but I couldn't get it to go up right. But if you turn your head the other way around, you can see one of the other kangaroo management solutions we were trialing, which was composting kangaroos using green waste. Sorry, I'm just really going quickly now, but this is that area in the autumn. So you can see, because we had the sheep in the drought lot, we were able to hold them there for a little while after it rained, and things were able to really recover nicely. And there's a sort of native glycine. It didn't look like this everywhere, but that's the kind of thing that it was allowed to grow because we had that had the sheep in the drought lot when it rained and let things grow for a little while. And then because we have so many paddocks, some of the paddocks still haven't been grazed since last year, apart from by kangaroos. Don't know why I put that photo in. This is a photo of our sheep from the kind of probably 10 years ago. So we've changed a few of our management practices a bit since then. We're no longer mules. So this is from the bad old days when we were still mulesing and we were still selecting for sheep with wrinkly bodies. but yeah, just to finish off, I'll just talk about how we're kind of trying to change our sheep to cope with the various pressures that are coming both from both in the industry and in terms of our climate. So we've moved from a traditional, superfine sheep type with where wool production is partly a function of surface area of the sheep. So having wrinkly sheep gives you a lot of surface area, means you can cut more wool, but it also can create fly strike issues, and the sheep are more likely to require mulesing. So we've ceased mulesing 5 or 6 years ago, and we're moving to a soft rolling skin type of sheep where wool cut comes from, rather than coming from having a wrinkly body and lots of skin surface area, it comes from having high density wool of fibre follicles on the skin and long staple legs. So the sheep, we're not at this stage yet, but our goal is to be shearing our sheep twice a year. And having plain-bodied sheep rather than wrinkly sheep should help us cope with wetter summers, warmer, and just like a longer fly strike season. Having sheep that are less vulnerable to fly strike will have many benefits, but climate change is certainly going to make that more important.
So I'm going to give you the wrap up shortly.
Yep,
Harry,
I know, that's it. I was just going to say I've been talking very quickly, and I wish I had more time, but if you're interested, but Dad's written a book about the farm called Millpost, which you can get through our website or from a few different bookshops, and there are some contact details up on the screen if you'd like to get in touch. So sorry sorry if I went a bit over time.
That's fine. That's all good. That's wonderful. Thanks, Harry. If you wanted to stop your screen share there, that was very informative, and I know I've written down some really good points from that. So, and we'll take some questions from everyone once we've heard from Helena, if that's okay. So Helena, would you like to jump on?
I will, I'm here.
Yep, and start sharing your screen.
Right, okay, well, very quickly.
Just while Helena's getting herself, okay. There we go. Yeah,
right,
that's great, so, Helena. Well done.
I got here. Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, Alex. It is a passion of ours that we run our farm in a way that is going to be productive and also adapt to climate change. I've been a project officer or a research officer, technical officer in various research projects with the Department of Primary Industries, and I worked with a sustainable grazing project with the Hawkesbury Nepean Catchment Management Authority before leaving government employment in 2009 to become full-time at farming and teaching horse riding. So we actually purchased this property in 2001. This is the property where the house sits, but we bought a second property in 2006, which is adjoining to this one, which gives us a total of 130 hectares. We also have an agistment block at Goulburn, which is very, very useful for being able to manage the two properties because they are in different rainfall zones. So it gives us the opportunity to completely rest one farm if there's feed on the other one. The farm we bought in 2001, which is where the house and the centre of operations operate from, was an extremely low production, highly eroded block, very little infrastructure, just 4 paddocks, 3 dams, and the creek at the front of the property, which has been permanent even through the 2 major droughts we've had, that was used to supply water to the stock that were on here. So it was eroded and it was in pretty ordinary condition. And I think Harry touched on it quite well, is that if you've got a farm plan, you can actually get funding for research project for improving your farm. So we set up a farm plan in 2001 when we bought the place, and it enabled us to get funding straight away to get to fence off the creek and to get some water, some dams in to replace the creek as a water supply. And that's been really important, that we stop putting animals on the creek and continuing that erosion problem. We run a Murray Grey stud. We've got 60 cows and calves with 24 replacement heifers. We quite often carry bulls for sale, but at the moment we don't have any. I think we've got 1 bull left for sale. But we're running those cows and calves at the moment, and the heifers on the 2 properties, because with the rain we find we need to sort of graze both farms. I'm also a riding instructor, and we've currently got 6 horses on the place, and we are running our place. We thought about it when we first moved here, was if we want to run a certain number of cattle, do you buy more land, or do you actually run the property that you own in a more intensive way? So we run a high input, high production strategy here, where we're producing a lot of feed in a smaller area than some other farms. It certainly does reduce your costs, because if you're running fertiliser and rotational grazing, you can run more stock on a smaller area, and you don't have the infrastructure costs of fencing and land rates and water supply on a bigger area. So that's our thoughts for when we first purchased the place, was to go high input, high production. The first time I was sort of really involved with anything to do with climate change was in about 2006 or 7. New South Wales DPI ran a climate change for farmers meetings, series of meetings, and got us really thinking about how we were going to adapt here to climate change. And there was a lot of information even back then in 2006 on what the impacts were going to be. So really, we've set up our farm not just thinking about climate change, but in a whole production system of managing for climate change, but also managing for productivity without having negative impacts on the property. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the issues that we've been considering over the last, certainly 15 years since I did that climate change course, but certainly the last 20 years since we bought the property here, on how we're managing this farm and why we're doing it the way we're doing it. So when we think about climate zones moving south, in other words, that the temperatures that you experienced at Dubbo and Nyngan and places like that is actually moving south. So we're going to see less winter spring rainfall, more summer storms, and how do we manage that? What is the strategy that we're following for managing this hotter, drier, wetter summer environment? So we like to think of our pastures as being rain ready. In other words, they're always ready to grow. We've also established some tropical pastures. We have let our paspalum grow. When we first came here, we noticed there were a few clumps of paspalum around the paddock. District advice then was to get rid of that and plant C3 pastures, or the winter active pastures, which, when you think about it, if we're going to get less winter rainfall and more summer rainfall, you're much better off having summer active pastures. So the paspalum that was already on paddocks here, we've nurtured that, and we've now got 4 or 5 paddocks that have paspalum growing in them quite well through summer, but they also have good perennial species, cocksfoot and phalaris and ryegrass growing in them through winter. We've just started growing some fodder trees, some Tagasasti, but it's a baby plantation, and my biggest struggle there is keeping the neighbours' sheep off them. So these are what we consider our rain-ready pastures. The 3 photos were actually taken at the same spot in the looking at our paddocks. In December, that paddock where you see the cows in the background, you'll actually see some dead standing grass there. We were feeding that off with molasses urea licks to those cows. At this stage, we weren't having to hand feed. We got rain on the 8th of February, and you can see that those pastures were already starting to regrow by the 23rd of February. And I took that photo on the 1st of September of what that's taken from the same place. And I used the dog as an example of how long that grass is, that pasture is now. This paddock will be probably taken for silage in the next few weeks. We're actually speaking to the contractor to come and cut that paddock for silage. So you can see that from December 19 to now, how much those pastures have really given us some productive feed. So how do we manage that? What our actions are, we do a lot of soil testing here, and we make sure that there's adequate soil nutrients for pasture growth. We're looking at increasing soil organic matter, because soil organic matter is the driver for a lot of productions, for a lot of pasture growth, and it also stores a lot of moisture. So I think there's something like, if you've got good increased soil organic matter in the soil, you've got an extra 25 to 30 millimetres of moisture held in the soil, which you can utilise going into drought or going into periods where you're going to see decreased water in your soil. We do rotational grazing. So we have a lot of small paddocks here, and paddocks, the cows are moved on and off paddocks as those grasses have recovered. Now we use the sort of dairy approach of 3-leaf rule. So once those paddocks have got at least 3 leaves on the pastures, we move animals on, but the animals are certainly moved off before we overgraze, and there's still leaf area on those plants. As I said before, we've encouraged the paspalum to grow, and our tree planting, including, is to get some Tagasasti growing for autumn feed when the plants are sort of really needing a rest. So the next consideration was higher temperatures. We're going to experience some higher temperatures here, and there's issues that that traditional pasture species like ryegrass isn't going to survive. So our strategy is to establish new perennial pastures containing fescue, phalaris, cocksfoot and paspalum and other good perennial species that will survive. We find here that our native species are not 100% suitable for cattle. Microlina is the best one, but it's very short and the cattle don't utilise it very well. And other species like kangaroo grass and the type of Danthonia that we had growing here was very low quality. In fact, the Danthonia was so poor quality, we just happened to get one of those species that is not as good a quality as other Danthonia species, and we couldn't utilise it. So we've gone through now and we're establishing perennial pastures across the property that are going to give us good quality, which we can manage. We do encourage the survival of native pastures just to make sure that we have got ground cover if anything else happens, because they are the best adapted plants to surviving through a drought. And of course, as I said before, we're planting Tagasasti to provide fodder and shade for these higher temperatures. So our next consideration was this unreliable rainfall and drought, that we were going to get big storm events, and the effect of this was going to be poor water security through droughts. We were going to see feed shortages, loss of ground cover, and the problem with overgrazing. Well, we're lucky here we don't have kangaroos. I don't know why, but we just happen to not have many. But certainly we want to avoid overgrazing on our pastures. The strategy for that was to make sure that we have dams with sufficient water for 4 years of supply. Now that's a pretty big ask. The dam that I've got the picture there is the one that's in front of the house. It had actually dropped by 2 metres, and it virtually filled overnight when we got that big rainfall event. We don't tend to use this dam for water supply, but there is a pump on it which we can use in case of bushfire, or we can reticulate into our water system. The water we tend to use on this property is from a permanent creek, and the permanent creek has continued to flow through since we've been here. The 19 years we've been here, we haven't yet seen it stop flowing. We can use that water to reticulate around the farm, but this dam here is an emergency supply. We've also got a dam in pretty much in every paddock, not very large dams, but they've certainly not very few of them have gone dry in the time we've been here. And if they do go dry, we take the opportunity then of cleaning them out and making sure that all the silt and the rubbish is removed at the bottom, which does make them a little bit deeper. We purchase hay and we make silage. We avoid damaging our pastures. We adjust our carrying capacity, and as I said before, we've got a few options of adjusting our carrying capacity. One of them is to sell the stock that we don't need. Another is to move them to Agistment, to the Agistment block that's at Goulburn. It's also very, very important that you understand the nutritional requirements of your stock. So, you know, I get a little bit horrified in this area when you drive around and you see cattle and sheep in pretty poor condition. You know, you really do need to be aware of the nutritional requirements of those animals. So what are our actions? As I said, we have large deep dams and we can reticulate water to troughs. And we're gradually increasing the number of troughs and our water supply across the farm. We've still got the block we bought in 2006 doesn't have water reticulated through that farm, and that's going to be our next plan, is to put a more permanent water supply over there. It is a separate block, it is a separate property, so it makes sense to have it self-reliant and make sure we've got a dams over there or water supply over there that is not reliant on this side of the farm. With hay sheds and silos, and we purchase feed when it's cheap, and I'll say at the moment relatively cheap, but we take opportunity of when feed supplies are not, you know, hitting that $500, $600, $700 a tonne mark, that we actually fill up our hay sheds and we make silage from the paddocks that we can take out of the grazing rotation. We don't tend to use drought lots a great deal, but we do have paddocks set up with water and feed pads that we can use as a drought lot if we absolutely need to. To date, we haven't needed to, but certainly the Agistment block where we can destock one farm and stock the other farm has certainly been a great advantage. We find it's really important to retain our core breeders. Even if we do reduce stock numbers, we don't get rid of our core breeding herd because we are a stud. Our genetics is important to us, and we've worked very, very hard to get the genetics that we want. So even though some farmers do completely destock, we don't. And I think at the moment, a lot of cattle farmers are finding it's very, very expensive, and probably sheep farmers as well. If they're completely destocked, it is very difficult to buy back in. At the moment, you know, cattle are up around the $2,000, $3,000 per head, and to make money back from them is going to take several years, and that's assuming they have a calf every year. And we also feed our stock according to their nutritional requirements. We don't let them lose weight, or we can afford to let them lose a little bit of weight, but we don't like to let them get into that condition score of 1 or 2. That's not how we operate. We'd rather sell stock and buy feed for the animals that we're retaining. Violent storms was another issue, and I think some of us have seen that occur over the last few months, and the effect of that is an erosion risk. So we really do maintain that 100% ground cover. Now, 100% ground cover doesn't have to be just grass. It can be dead grass, it can be leaves and sticks, it can be weeds, it can be whatever you've got on the ground. That photo I've got there is some paspalum that you can see that is just regenerating from having had some storm on it, but the clumps of dead grass there was enough ground cover to actually protect the soil. We've also done a fair bit of creek rehabilitation here. This is because the creeks we bought here were highly eroded, and by fencing them off, we were able to maintain, well, to stop those further eroding and sending soil further down into the Wyangler Dam. So our action is to rotationally graze to make sure that we've always got pasture. We need to slow the speed of the water in watercourses and across the ground. So you can slow the water down moving across the ground. It's not going to pick up soil particles and move them. Windbreak fencing we've got throughout the farm also acts as a buffer. So our windbreaks are fenced off, so there's quite often long grass. So if there is water moving across a paddock, it's going to get trapped in those buffer areas. So it doesn't continue, so it does slow that water down across the paddocks. And also planting more trees, really sort of thinking about slowing that wind speed down so we're not losing ground soil to wind, and we're giving that little bit of protection to our pastures and to our stock if there are violent storms, just to slow that wind. Now this is a picture of, we're very proud of this. This is the property, the second property we bought in 2006 had a very, very highly eroded creek at the back of it. And a few years ago, we were able to get funding through, oh, hang on, who was it? Who was the funding? I think it might have been Landcare funding that paid for us to put, to reinstate the chain of ponds on the back of the property. For those of you that know the Maloon Creek work that's been done at the moment, that only got permission to go ahead after we were able to demonstrate that our sort of 2 kilometres of creek was able to be rehabilitated and not lose it. Now these chains of ponds were put in prior to the big rainfall events we got in 2016, and it really did slow the water down, push the water out onto the floodplain, and even though we had a few small failures on some of the banks, we were able to demonstrate that we could stop that huge erosion problem that was occurring on this creek. So we've been very proud of this. We've been able to fence that off. We're putting trees into that area, and the water there is being held back and slowed down, just to create that loss of erosion, slow that erosion down. And the Maloon Creek project went ahead after ours was shown to be successful. Extreme temperature days, but heat stress is a problem. It's hard to get a photo of heat stress, but certainly cold stress as well. So we are experiencing extremes, extreme frost, extreme cold, extreme snowfall events, which are all a problem for livestock and a problem for sort of managing feed supply and things. Our strategy is to provide shade and shelter for trees, and also to have heat-resistant livestock. So planting trees, moving stock, being able to move stock to paddocks now with shelter, because when we bought these 2 properties, there were virtually no trees on both of them. In fact, the second property we bought in 2006, it had actually been owned by some sawmillers who took out every single tree on the block. And we've got one paddock, which is, we call it one tree, because they left one tree on the whole block. So we were virtually starting off with no trees and no protection, and no protection for our stock. So tree planting has been a big program here since we bought the place. And the other action we've got for extreme temperature days is to have light coated coloured light coat coloured cattle. I know the Angus Society have done a very good job marketing their black cattle, but there's going to have to come a time when they accept that the silver gene will have to be reintroduced to Angus cattle. When I say reintroduced, Angus cattle were not all black 100 years ago. They did have silver and red genes as well. So accepting that light coloured cattle are better adapted to heat than dark coloured cattle is going to be very important. So we are still maintaining our silver Murray Greys, but we can also breed black Murray Greys to suit the people that get the bonus, the additional money that comes to them from just being black. And we have a lot of trouble with accepting that as an issue. An increased risk of frost is another huge problem. We see frosts occurring longer into the season. In fact, you can still get a December frost here. And you get very little pasture growth through winter. The other effect that increased frost has is higher sugar levels in pasture, which is a huge problem for people with horses, and that increased risk of getting laminitis. So some of our strategies here, rotationally grazing certainly helps maintain the pastures that we have, and we don't just set stock and eat everything that's in the paddock. We keep, by having feed in front of us all the time, you can take into account that slow winter growth. We really need to grow sufficient pasture in autumn to get us through winter, and with more prediction of more autumn rains, that's going to be probably an easier thing to do than in the past. Your pastures need to be ready to grow in winter, as early as coming out of winter as soon as possible. And the other strategy is that we need to manage our horses for that risk of laminitis in winter and autumn, and winter and spring, sorry. One of our actions that we take, and look, there's a whole lot of actions which we can take for this, but a major action is that adequate soil fertility. There's been a fair bit of evidence that adequate potassium levels in the soil helps plants resist cold stress, and we also do a strategic nitrogen use for grass growth. So in the autumn months, in the A months, so April and August, we make sure that we have sufficient nitrogen in some of our paddocks, so that the grass will respond much more quickly in that coming into and out of winter, because clover nitrogen doesn't take into effect until the soil temperature gets to 10 degrees, but grass will grow at 5 degrees. So it's really important that you have that nitrogen in the system ready for growth coming out of winter. We don't do it necessarily with urea or with bag fertilisers. We use a lot of poultry litter here, and poultry litter is very high in nitrogen. So if we're going to apply poultry litter to our paddocks, we are also supplying a good supply of nitrogen fertiliser, so those pastures can grow. And our action for our horses is, and I've only got one Laminitic horse here, but he has to go into a horse yard and wear a muzzle when there's a risk of frost around, just because those pastures get much higher in sugar when there's been a frost. Another problem that was indicated back 20 years ago when we were talking about climate change was the high temperature, wind and low humidity. And I think I saw a paper once which said by 2020, it was written about 15 years ago, by 2020 we were going to see extreme bushfire events. Well, guess what happened in 2020? We got extreme bushfire events. So high temperature, wind and low humidity with bushfire risk. Strategy is to reduce fuel load and to have a bushfire plan. So our action is to graze and slash paddocks to the west of the house, remove fuel. This year we knew that we had a lot of pine trees to the west of the house, and we got somebody in to actually come and take those pine trees out. We've replaced them with deciduous trees on that western side of the house. So I think Harry mentioned it too. We hope that going around that, sort of having deciduous trees there is going to reduce your bushfire risk because those deciduous trees are less flammable. You need to make sure that your firefighting equipment is ready and in working order, having a safe area for stock, and be ready to leave. The policy of people staying to defend has been disastrous for some people. So even though we'd hate to thought of losing our stock, losing your life is probably another issue anyway. So that's our actions for bushfire risk. Another major problem that's been brought up, and my partner is a vet, so he's very interested in animal disease. There's an increased risk of disease such as Akabani, femoral fever, Queensland itch. Blue tongue is also an issue, but not so much for small farmers, but certainly diseases like Akabani and Queensland itch in horses is going to be a major problem. There's some strategies of vaccination and exposing stock prior to joining. We've thought that for our actions, we run our heifers over on the Agistment block, and it's sort of tending to be more into that Akabani blue tongue zone than we are on this side of the hill. So we want to think that we can expose our heifers to these diseases after joining, but at the moment the Akabani isn't a problem, and it's only coming in waves, so animals may not get exposed. We could move our calving period to autumn, but that creates other problems because our pasture supply isn't good through winter and our animals don't grow as well through winter, so we have to think about that risk. Monitoring the insects, one way of doing that is that horses show signs of Queensland itch when those insects that cause those diseases are in the district. Horses get Queensland itch, so we know that we might actually have an insect problem at that time. But this issue of the insects being on the move is something that's going to be new to us all, and we're all going to have to learn to live with it. And I'll just show you sorry, I picked these up this morning and they're a bit blurry, but this is the blue tongue zone. Now, blue tongue is an indicator disease of where these midges that cause these diseases are moving. In 2016, the blue tongue zone, I think you can see my cursor, just came down to Sydney. So the light shaded area is where the zone is, and then there's a buffer zone in that darker shade on the outside, and the green area was considered free of blue tongue. Blue tongue is a disease of sheep, but it affects animals. It's caused by the same sort of insects that cause Akabani and Queensland itch and those other ones, which are a problem to local farmers here. This is over here on the right. In 4 years, that blue tongue zone has moved to be down near Canberra, and it goes out to Queanbeyan, and it includes Braidwood. So that area means that those diseases which we are at risk of getting are moving south and moving a little bit more to the west. So we need to be aware of that just for our animals' health issues. If you want to know about the problems that diseases like Akabani would cause, we do have that information, but it's best if you want to investigate that, probably to look it up or talk to me later, or include the disease risk in your in some of the programs that Alex could probably run in the future. There's certainly a consumer pressure coming in about sort of people being told to avoid meat consumption, and certainly welfare issues when it comes to keeping stock in hot climates. So the strategy to lower methane, capturing carbon and reducing your carbon footprint is all going to be very important. Our actions sort of is probably to educate farmers and consumers that there are things that, there are benefits that we can do. Even things like breeding cattle that will finish on pasture by 12 months of age. So that steer in that photo, at 9 months of age, he won a carcass competition, and he was actually finished. He had fat cover at 9 months and was market ready. So that means, and that was off, which means we don't have to put them into feedlots. We don't have to send them to backgrounders. We can reduce the number of movements those animals actually make in their life, and have them ready for the markets quite early before the before they're sort of over their lifetime that they're going to produce more methane. Cattle nutrition is another issue. So if we keep those high levels of nutrition, so even high quality pastures, it does reduce the methane output. So metabolizable energy is a measurement of energy in minus energy out, and the energy includes methane. And the studies that we did at DPI back in the 80s and 90s certainly showed that an increased quality, high quality feed reduced the methane output. So even as simple as improving our pastures is going to go a long way towards reducing methane output. Monitor soil organic carbon levels. There was, as we discussed earlier, that's something that there's a lot of different methods. We've been monitoring ours for 18 years, and we've seen an increase in soil organic carbon of about 1.5% across the whole farm. I can calculate how much carbon dioxide equivalent that is to, but it is very high. Soil organic carbon, if you want to grow carbon in your soil, you need to have good soil fertility, good grazing management, good ground cover, and all of those things will help you increase the carbon level. And that's work that's currently being done by a number of groups, and I'll send those links to Alex. And we also have solar panels on the roof. We put them in about 2010. And what you really need to do if you've got solar panels is use the energy when you are producing it. So we pump water or heat water or do our laundry, all those things when we're making power. And then at night we've reduced our energy by putting LED lights in throughout the house and things like that. So really think about how you are using power, but that's been a really important part of from our point of view of reducing our carbon footprint.
So
and
Helena,
we produce, sorry?
Oh, sorry, Helena. I'm just giving you, we've gone over a little bit. So,
okay, well, I've nearly finished.
Oh, cool. I don't want to interrupt you because both you and Harry have been terribly interesting, but I was just you asked me to, so I'm just jumping in there. Thank you.
That's fine. I've got one more slide. Yeah, so just what can you do in your environment to reduce your carbon footprint is really important. What else? As I said, farm plans have been really important for us. We monitor. We soil test every year. Not necessarily the whole farm, but certainly farms that we think haven't been fertilised for a while. By using poultry litter, we only do 1/5 of the farm a year. So we put on high levels of fertiliser every 5 years instead of trying to fertilise the whole farm frequently. We look at our pasture quantity, certainly consider our pasture quality and understanding plant identification. So we find that paddocks which we haven't used haven't fertilised and haven't got the fertility right, we actually grow more annuals and fewer perennial pastures, and the clover doesn't nodulate and all those sorts of things if you're not sort of really looking at what plants are there. And you do need to know how to identify different plants, because they all do have different different requirements for grazing and management and rest periods and those sorts of things. So if you don't know what you've got, it's very hard to manage it. There's a lot of decision making. There are decision making courses that you can do and websites and getting farm plans done and making decisions based on those. Taking timely action is really important. We start hand feeding as soon as our animals start to lose weight. We don't wait until they look like they're heading towards condition score 2. And staying informed, doing your reading, doing your research, listening to people that know what they're talking about is very, very important. You know, as I said, I did my first climate change workshop back in I attended it back in 2006, and it's really changed the way we run our farm. It's really given us a lot of information. In saying that, I'm a committee member of the New South Wales Grassland Society, and I'm holding a session on the 5th of October. There'll actually be 2 sessions because I'm limited to 20 people. So it's really just a pasture walk, field day, to look at farmers that have been using alternate field days. It starts at our place at Binda at either 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock. And I'm going to send this information to Alex, who's going to send it out, and we're going to have a look at what changes are happening in the soil for farmers that are using alternative fertiliser. Also, when I say alternative fertilisers, I mean not coming out of a bag, as looking at composts and poultry litters and poultry manure and gypsum and lime and those sorts of things. So that's just something to, if you want more information on various things, there's an awful lot of organisations that are really doing good work. You know, there's Landcare and sort of our Grassland Society and things like that are really doing good work on teaching farmers or informing farmers on how to improve their management and how to get through, to take advantage of climate change, not feel that it's a threat, actually work for it, use it as an opportunity. Anyway, that's me. So thank you for listening, and I'll take questions.
Thanks,
I think
Helena.
Alex has given us time for answering questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Helena and Harry. That was a wonderful snapshot of what you're doing on your farms.
Thanks, Jo.
Thank you so much. So there was one question for Helena, which was, what strategies do you use to increase soil organic matter? And I think you sort of answered that a little bit through your presentation, but did you want to just talk to that just a little bit?
Yeah, that's fine. Look, the work that's been done, it's Susan Orgel and Alan Richardson and a whole lot of really very, very good researchers from around Australia, making sure there is sufficient fertility in the soil and sufficient ground cover. Sufficient moisture is also important, but that's a hard one to control because that's, unless you've got irrigation. For the microbes that do the work at cycling organic matter to actually form soil organic carbon. So if you don't have sufficient nutrient, the animal actually uses up the nutrient in the organic matter to survive, and it actually releases carbon. So there's a fair bit of work being done on what are the processes involved in growing organic carbon, not using it. Ploughing is a great way of getting rid of your soil organic carbon. Ploughed paddocks, crop paddocks reducing organic carbon, whereas grazed paddocks, well-managed grazed paddocks, increase in organic carbon. And that's, as I said, we've been monitoring ours for a long time now, and we're certainly seeing an increase. I just thought of another one. pH is so important. Improving the liming your paddocks and improving your pH even to depth, and not by incorporating it, but actually by letting it move down the profile. Keeping your pH at 5.2 instead of, as a lot of farms are, at 4.2 is really useful, because the bacteria that are involved in improving your soil organic carbon don't like acid soils, don't like acid environments. So lime is relatively cheap, and it really does a fantastic job, and it improves clover nodulation, improves pasture growth, improves pasture species, a whole lot of other benefits other than soil organic carbon. But it's certainly one of the strategies we've used is to get around the farm and put adequate lime on. And that lime, put it on once in the last 10 years.
Mm. All right, Helena, I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but we are going over a little bit. So I just would like to say thank you so much to both yourself and Harry, because that was a very informative session. And I'm going to let you know that I'm stopping the recording of this session now. So